The air in the Grand Zerthian spire tasted like arrogance. Zarazel of House Vlera inhaled it like perfume, her iridescent scales shimmering under the triple suns as she strode through the opulent halls of her family's orbital palace. Servants, lesser species from a dozen conquered worlds, scurried out of her path, eyes downcast. She flicked a clawed hand, dismissing a human attendant who dared offer her a drink without being summoned. "Useless creature," she muttered, watching the man flinch. "Your kind couldn't even master fire without burning yourselves." Laughter rippled through her entourage of sycophants, all highborn Zerthians like her. They lounged on floating divans, gossiping about the latest political scandals, who'd lost a starship in a wager, who'd been caught with a pleasure synth. Zarazel barely listened. Her attention snagged on the newsfeed glowing above the courtyard. Another human colony petitioning for independence. Pathetic. As if the galaxy would miss their grubby little outposts. "Your father's fleet will crush them, surely," murmured Heiress, her closest and only friend, if such a term could be applied to their razor-edged camaraderie. Zarazel smirked. Like stepping on insects. The party dissolved into cruel amusement, but the moment shattered when the first explosion rocked the spire. Alarms shrieked. The sky fractured with plasma fire. Zarazel's world tipped sideways as a blast tore through the courtyard, hurling her into a pillar. Pain lanced through her ribs. Smoke choked the air. Through the haze, she saw figures in black combat armor housed Heiress assassins. Her family's rivals. She ran. Not out of strategy, but pure instinct. Her silks tearing as she vaulted over rubble. Her heart a drumbeat of terror. The spire's lower levels were a maze of service tunnels, and she plunged into them, her arrogance stripped away with every ragged breath. They were hunting her. She knew what happened to fallen heiresses. No quick death, but humiliation, ransom, or worse. Hours later, bleeding and lost, she stumbled into the Undercity. The stench hit her first: rotting food, unwashed bodies, the acrid tang of industrial runoff. The buildings here hunched like starving beasts, their walls scarred with graffiti in languages she didn't recognize. A pair of lurksy gangsters eyed her from a shadowed alcove, their bladed tails twitching. She straightened, summoning the last dregs of her dignity. "I am Zarazel of House Vlera. Take me to your overseer, and you'll be rewarded." The lurksy laughed. "Pretty scales. They'll fetch a price." She backed away, panic rising, until a voice cut through the gloom. "That's enough." A human stepped into the flickering neon light. Tall, scarred, his face all hard angles under a short crop of dark hair. He wore a battered duster and carried himself like someone who'd long since stopped fearing anything, including her. Zarazel bristled. You will escort me to nowhere," he interrupted, tossing a credit chip to the lurksy. They snatched it and vanished. He looked her up and down, unimpressed. "You're either the worst assassin I've ever seen, or the unluckiest rich girl in the sector." Her frill flared in outrage. "I am." "Yeah, I heard. House Vlera." He sighed. "Which means you've got about 5 minutes before someone cuts your throat for bragging rights." She wanted to sneer, to demand obedience, but the weight of the last day crashed over her. Her legs trembled. The human, Kale, she'd learn later, watched her sway, then muttered something foul under his breath. "Come on, princess, unless you'd rather die standing here." He turned and walked away. After a heartbeat, Zarazel followed. Here's section 2 of your story, tightly focused on character development and escalating tension while keeping every line purposeful. The safe house was a closet. Zarazel stood in the doorway, her nose wrinkling at the smell of stale protein packs and gun oil. A single bulb flickered overhead, illuminating cracked walls papered with star charts and bounty notices. Kale shoved past her, tossing a medkit onto the cot that took up half the floor. "Sit," he said, jerking his chin at it. "Unless you'd rather bleed on my floor." She touched her side, her fingers coming away glistening with violet-tinged blood. The pain had been a distant throb beneath the adrenaline, but now it sharpened, needling her ribs with every breath. "Your floor is all ready." Save the speech. He rummaged through a rusted cabinet, coming up with a bottle of something that smelled like engine fuel. This'll hurt. She barely had time to hiss a curse before he poured it over the gash. Fire lanced through her nerves. Her claws tore into the cot's thin mattress. You filthy human. Still talking, so it worked. He tossed her a wad of gauze. Press down. She wanted to fling it back in his face. Wanted to scream at him for daring to touch her. For the indignity of this place. For the way his eyes skimmed over her like she was just another problem to solve. But the blood kept coming, and the room tilted when she stood too fast. So she pressed the gauze to her side and seethed in silence. Cale moved to the room's only other feature, a dented hot plate, and set a pot of water to boil. You're lucky, he said, not looking at her. Timorese hounds usually take heads as trophies. She stiffened. You know who's after me. Everyone does. He dumped powdered broth into the water. Your family's been broadcasting your face for hours. Missing heiress. Substantial reward. A beat. Dead or alive. The words slithered down her spine. She'd expected her father to send fleets, to burn the Undercity to cinders until she was found. Not this. Not bargaining with scavengers and knife ears for her corpse. The broth bubbled, filling the room with the scent of fake meat and salt. Cale poured it into 2 chipped mugs and held one out to her. She stared at it. What is wrong with you? His brow arched. You hungry or not? I don't eat human slop. Fine. He set her mug on the floor. Starve. She watched him drink, his throat working as he swallowed. Her stomach twisted, but she refused to look at the broth. Refused to admit that her body was traitor enough to want it. Silence stretched. Outside, the Undercity groaned. Distant shouts. The whine of hoverbikes. Something heavy dragging through the alleys. Cale checked the pistol at his hip, then tossed her a threadbare blanket. Get some sleep. We move at first light. To where? Somewhere you're not my problem anymore. She wanted to argue. Wanted to demand a ship, guards, anything befitting her station. But the cot sagged under her weight, and exhaustion hit like a hammer. She dreamed of fire. Morning came with a boot to her shoulder. Zarzell jerked upright, frill flaring. Cale stood over her, already strapped into his gear. Up. We've got company. She heard it then, the scrape of metal on stone, too close. Her pulse spiked. Assassins. Worse. He cracked the door's peephole. Bounty hunters. 3 of them. A hulking Tarkian with a plasma cutter, a wiry Vexian whose cybernetic eyes whirred as they scanned the street, and between them, a human woman with a smile like a knife. Zarzell's breath caught. You have to fight them. Cale snorted. I have to not die. He palmed a smoke grenade from his belt. When I say run, you run. Stick to the left alley. It's a maze, but it loops to the transit hub. And you? His grin was all teeth. I'll be busy. The grenade rolled into the street. Smoke erupted, thick and chemical. The bounty hunters cursed. Cale kicked the door open and fired twice. Not at them, but at the overhead pipes. Scalding steam geysered down. Asterisk run. Asterisk. She ran. The alley swallowed her, its walls close enough to scrape her shoulders. Behind her, shouts. A scream. The crack of a pistol. She didn't look back. The transit hub was a cacophony of stalls and shuttles, its crowds a blur of species. She shoved through them, her heart in her throat. A hand grabbed her wrist and yanked her into a cargo container. Cale slammed the door behind them. He was bleeding, a gash across his temple painting half his face red. Told you to loop left, he panted. You left me. I saved you. He wiped his face, smearing blood. Those weren't just hunters. That woman, Lizette, she's Timorese personal butcher. Which means, they know I'm alive. The realization curdled in her gut. She'd been stupid to hope otherwise. Cale leaned against the wall, his breath slowing. We need to get off planet. There's a freighter leaving for the border fringe in 6 hours. Cruise clean, they won't ask questions. She studied him, the way his hands shook slightly, the sweat on his neck. He'd killed for her, bled for her, and he expected nothing in return. Why? The word slipped out before she could stop it. He met her eyes. Why what? Why are you helping me? For the first time, he looked away. Let's just say I owe someone. She opened her mouth, to demand answers, to sneer, something. But the cargo container shuddered. A voice outside barked orders. Search teams. Cale pressed a finger to his lips. In the dark, with his blood on her hands, Zarazel understood one thing. She was no longer the hunter. She was prey. The freighter reeked of hopelessness. Zarazel crouched behind a stack of crates in the ship's grime-streaked hold, her claws digging into her palms. The air was thick with the stench of engine coolant and unwashed bodies. A far cry from the lavender-scented halls of her family's spire. Cale knelt beside her, his pistol a dull gleam in the dim light, his breathing steady despite the blood drying on his temple. She wanted to scream at him, demand answers. Asterisk, who do you owe? Why risk everything for me? Asterisk, but the words withered in her throat. Outside their hiding spot, boots clanged against the metal gangway. Lizette's voice cut through the hum of the engines. Check the manifests. If they're here, they'll be listed as cargo. Cale's hand tightened around his weapon. His eyes met Zarazel's. Asterisk, stay silent. Asterisk. She hated that she obeyed. A rat scuttled past her foot, its fur matted with oil. She recoiled, her frill flaring, and a crate toppled. The crash echoed like a detonation. Silence. Then, a chuckle. Well, Lizette purred. Looks like our little Heiress isn't so highborn anymore. Cale moved before Zarazel could blink. He shoved her behind him as gunfire erupted, the muzzle flashes painting the hold in strobes of hellish light. A round grazed her arm, searing pain spiderwebbing up to her shoulder. She bit back a cry. Asterisk, run! Asterisk, Cale snarled, firing blind over the crates. She ran, but not toward the exit. Something primal and furious uncoiled in her chest. She snatched a fallen pipe from the floor, her muscles singing with adrenaline, and swung. The blow caught Lizette across the jaw. The woman staggered, her smile never fading. Oh, kitten, she crooned, wiping blood from her lip. You shouldn't have done that. Zarazel barely registered the knife in Lizette's hand before it flashed toward her throat. And Cale was there. He took the blade in his side with a grunt, his pistol pressed under Lizette's chin. Asterisk, bang, asterisk, he whispered. The shot vaporized her skull. The remaining hunters faltered. Cale didn't. He fired twice more, and the hold fell silent. Then he collapsed. Zarazel caught him before he hit the ground, her hands slick with his blood. You! Asterisk, idiot, asterisk, she hissed, her voice cracking. You stupid, reckless. Yeah. His laugh was wet. Guess I am. She tore a strip from her ruined silks, pressing it to the wound. His blood was too red, too human, staining her fingers. Why? She demanded again, her throat tight. You don't even like me. Cale's gaze drifted past her, toward the freighter's flickering emergency lights. My sister, he said softly. She was on New Tyrannies. The name punched through her. New Tyrannies. A human colony. One her father had glassed for defiance. Her stomach turned to lead. She was a doctor, Cale continued. Fixed up Zerthians, even when her own people called her a traitor. His fingers twitched toward his pocket, where a frayed photo peeked out. A woman with Cale's eyes smiling. I swore I'd balance the scales. Zarazel's breath left her in a rush. All this time, she'd been nothing but a debt to him, a transaction. And yet, he'd nearly died for her anyway. The ship shuddered, warning sirens blaring. They were out of time. She hauled Cale's arm over her shoulders, ignoring his protests. Shut up, she snapped. We're getting out of here. He was too weak to argue. The escape pod jettisoned with a roar, the freighter shrinking behind them as it hurtled toward the jump point. Cale slumped against the seat, his breathing shallow. Outside the viewport, the stars burned cold and indifferent. Zarazel gripped the controls, her mind racing. She could return home, could reclaim her title, her power, could forget this ever happened. But then she looked at Kale, at the man who'd bled for a stranger, who'd fought for a ghost, and something in her chest shifted. She input new coordinates. Where? Kale coughed. Where are we going? Zarazel smiled, felt foreign on her lips, like a muscle long and used. To finish what you started. The coordinates led to ruin. Zarazel guided the escape pod through the corpse of New Tyrannies' orbital dock, her stomach twisting at the skeletal remains of ships still drifting where her father's weapons had left them. The planet below was a scar. Continents blackened, oceans boiled to steam. She'd seen holos of the bombardment, had even laughed at the tactical reports. Now, the silence of the dead pressed against the pod's hull like a living thing. Kale stirred in the co-pilot's seat, his face ashen under the med patch she'd slapped over his wound. You shouldn't have come here, he rasped. She ignored him, steering toward the only structure still standing, a derelict medical station, its solar panels cracked but still humming with residual power. You said your sister was a doctor. His jaw tightened. She was. The docking clamps engaged with a shudder. Zarazel hesitated, her hand hovering over the hatch release. For the first time in her life, she feared what lay beyond a door. Not assassins or rival houses, but truth. The kind that couldn't be shouted down or bought off. She opened it anyway. The station's interior was a tomb. Dust swirled in the pale emergency lights, settling over broken equipment and toppled gurneys. A child's drawing, a stick-figure family with too many arms, was still taped to a wall. Kale limped past her, his fingers brushing a faded bloodstain on the floor. This is where they made their last stand, he said softly. The Zerthian fleet demanded surrender. Lissa told them to go to hell. Zarazel's frill lay flat against her skull. She could see it, the humans barricading the doors, the plasma fire melting through. Her father's voice in her calm, smug with victory, like stepping on insects. Her own words. She turned away, bile rising in her throat, and froze. A terminal flickered in the corner, its screen cracked but active. The emergency beacon. Kale. Her voice sounded alien to her own ears. They're still broadcasting. He was at her side in an instant, his breath catching as he deciphered the garbled code. It's a loop, coordinates, encrypted, but the signal's too weak to. She ripped the panel off the wall before he could finish, her claws slicing through fried wiring. I know this system, her family's encryption, her father's arrogance. The pieces snapped together. It's a rally point for survivors. Kale's hand closed over hers, warm and rough. Why are you doing this? She met his gaze. Because no one else will. The coordinates led to an asteroid belt on the fringe of the system, its rocks pockmarked with hidden tunnels. Their pod's sensors barely registered the heat signatures. A handful of life forms, buried deep. Zarazel landed in a cavernous docking bay, its lights flaring to life as their pod touched down. Shadows moved in the archways beyond. Human silhouettes, gaunt, armed. A woman stepped forward, her rifle trained on Zarazel's chest. She had Kale's eyes. Lissa. Kale's voice broke. The rifle didn't waver. You brought a Vlera here. Zarazel didn't flinch. She dropped to her knees, not in surrender, but in something far more dangerous. Purpose. I'm here to burn my house to the ground, she said. Help me or shoot me, but decide quickly. The silence stretched. Then Lissa lowered the gun. Welcome to the rebellion, princess. The rebel base smelled of desperation and determination in equal measure. Zarazel stood in the dimly lit war room, her claws tracing the grooves of a makeshift table carved from asteroid rock. Around her, the last survivors of New Tyrannies watched with eyes that held no mercy, only calculation. She didn't blame them. If their positions were reversed, she'd have shot herself on sight. Lissa circled her like a scavenger bird assessing carrion. You expect us to believe a Vlera wants to help? Her voice was flint striking steel. Your family turned 3 generations of my people to ash. Zarazel met her gaze without flinching. I expect nothing, but I know things. She tapped the holodisk on the table, and her father's fleet deployments flickered to life above the surface. Supply routes, security codes, the location of every black site where your people are still imprisoned. The room went still. Kale, leaning against the wall with his wound freshly stitched, exhaled sharply. You stole classified tactical data. I inherited it. Her frill twitched. The benefit of being a spoiled heiress. No one thinks to guard the archives from you. Lissa's fingers hovered over the hologram, her face unreadable. Why now? The question hung in the air. Zarazel could lie, could claim strategy or revenge against House Dmora. But the weight of the medical station's dust still clung to her, and the ghost of that child's drawing burned behind her eyes. Because I finally looked, she said simply. A beat. Then Lissa barked a laugh and slapped the table. We move in 12 hours. The prison transport on the Kesser Run will be lightly guarded, thanks to her intel. She jerked her chin at Zarazel. You'll be on the slicer team. Try to betray us, and I'll space you myself. Zarazel inclined her head. Fair bargain. Later, in the narrow bunkroom she'd been given, a closet with a cot, but at least it locked. Kale found her scrubbing dried blood from her scales with a ragged cloth. He tossed her a fresh medkit. For the burn on your arm. She caught it one-handed. Shouldn't you be resting? That knife missed your kidney by a centimeter. Funny. Lissa said the same thing. He lingered in the doorway, his silhouette framed by the corridor's flickering glow. You really meant what you said back there. It wasn't a question. She set the cloth aside. My father used to say mercy was the luxury of the powerful. A muscle jumped in her jaw. He was wrong. Mercy is the one thing they can't afford. Kale studied her for a long moment. Then, quietly, the Kesser Run is a suicide mission, even with your codes. I know. You could still walk away. She stood, her shadow stretching across the floor between them. So could you. His grin was a quick, bright thing in the dark. Guess we're both idiots. The alarms blared 6 hours early. Zarazel was on her feet in an instant, grabbing the pistol Lissa had grudgingly issued her. The base shuddered not from within but from outside. Orbital bombardment. She sprinted for the command center, skidding past rebels already sealing bulkheads. The main screen showed the nightmare unfolding above. A Zerthian dreadnought, its hull emblazoned with House Vlerres' crest, unleashing torpedoes into the asteroid field. Her father had found them. Lissa was barking orders, her face lit by the tactical display. They're scrambling our comms. Evac pods won't make it past there. She broke off as Zarazel shouldered through the crowd. Give me an open channel. Zarazel's voice cut through the chaos. Like hell, snapped a rebel. Lissa's eyes locked onto hers. Understanding flashed between them. She tossed Zarazel a headset. The comm crackled to life. Zarazel inhaled, and for the first time in her life, spoke not as a Vlera, but as herself. Father. The word echoed across the bridge of every Zerthian ship. You want me? Here I am. Silence. Then his voice smooth as poisoned wine. Come home, daughter. This rebellion ends tonight. She smiled. Yes, it does. And cut the transmission. Lissa was already moving. You heard the lady. All power to engines were taking their flagship. As the rebels roared into action, Kale appeared at Zarazel's side, his shoulder brushing hers. You realize he'll never forgive this. She adjusted her grip on the pistol. The weight felt right. I know. The dreadnought loomed on the view screen, its guns glowing hot. Zarazel bared her teeth. Let's go.